I'm glad you've chosen us to bring you the latest coverage in KwaZulu-Natal, and there's so many different aspects to the problems, particularly around Durban right now. There's a situation around drinking water, around food, around housing. There's the fact that there is, this weekend, I'm afraid to say, more rain scheduled, or more rain forecast. And then there's the situation on the N3. So many trucks still queued up in a long line. They can't enter the city. Transnet had to close its port in Durban because of the storm. The trucks are now backed up, as I understand it, outside the Marianhill Toll Plaza. Gavin Kelly is the CEO of the Road Freight Association. Gavin, good afternoon to you. Let's just start with this queue of trucks. Is it still there?
Good afternoon, Stephen. Good afternoon to all your listeners. There is still a bit of a queue there. It's not as long as it used to be. We've managed to work through that queue and get some of the trucks out into some safer depots. And some of them have moved on to where they needed to go. So there is still a bit of a queue there, but not as bad as it was last night.
Where are trucks actually going? If they can't get into Durban, where do they go from there? Do they have depots to even go to? And you've got to turn them around somehow as well.
Well, there are a couple of alternatives that they have. Some of them do have depots down in KZN. Others will try and find a parking spot somewhere close to the port or somewhere in an industrial area where they will feel safe. And then some of them will turn around and go back up the N3 and go find a truck stop. So those are the three sorts of areas that trucks will go and wait.
Is there a concern, and we've seen, particularly on the N3, I'm afraid, we've seen attacks on trucks before, not so much in the Durban area around Marianhill, certainly further up the N3 or further north on the N3, but is there a concern that trucks that are stationary are going to be vulnerable to some kind of criminality?
We had that concern last night, Stephen. We actually sent out a message to our members and to all truck operators or truck transporters, if you want to call them that, and asked them to make sure that they didn't get caught in the queue if they were still on their way, to stop at a truck stop along the way or a holding area if they could find one. We asked our members to open their depots to allow trucks to come in and stay safely overnight because there is that concern. And there were some bits of information filtering through from the Road Traffic Inspectorate and the local police community forums saying that there were some plans to do some looting, but it seems to have been contained. It didn't seem to happen.
Obviously, for the moment, trucks shouldn't really settle for Durban at this stage. They should stay where they are.
Yes, right now we've got a fair amount of disruption in the port. Transnet is trying its very, very best to get goods flowing again. They've been keeping us updated as we go along. There are a number of keys that are working, but obviously with the amount of water around, and of course we don't know what's happened to the access roads or to some of the ground, so we are proceeding very, very cautiously. But we have asked those who weren't on the N3, those who are not yet left any of their depots up in the Free State or Gauteng, to check first with Transnet or their clearing agents as to what the status is and maybe delay those departures for as long as possible.
Is there any indication at this stage of when the port will reopen fully? I mean, based on what you're telling us, based on the sheer amount of water, we've all seen the containers floating down the river in Durban. It could actually be quite a long time.
It could. We know that Bay Road is very, very badly damaged and that the assessors are only coming in today and then probably will do a very, very precursory check and then a lot more assessment will be done from Tuesday. So this is probably going to take at least a week to two because we don't know what some of the approaches to the bridges are like. We've seen a couple of those washed away, and of course the rivers are still flowing very strongly. They're still undercutting some of the banks, and there's a lot more rain forecast for the next couple of hours. So I think this is probably going to turn into about a month or two before we really get back to what we were before the rains.
So we need to talk a little bit more about this, and I think this is going to be the important issue. I think you're right to point to it, Gavin, if I may say. So the N3, we know, big, strong national road, well maintained. It seems to be managed properly. Everything seems to be fine there in terms of getting that up and going. But that's just the sort of beginning of the journey in a way. Once the truck's, on the N3, once it gets to Durban, there's still other roads. And this is just the port we're talking about. I mean, people living in the interior of KZN need trucks too. Bread doesn't get dropped off by bicycle, it's usually dropped off by truck. All of those roads have been so badly damaged.
Yes, it's not just the access roads around the port. It's the little roads around as well that have been severely damaged. And of course, where there are a couple of potholes, those potholes have allowed the water to get in under the road surface. So there's a lot of damage. And there's a lot of damage on some of the regional routes around. So the the M4 and the N2 down the south coast towards the Eastern Cape has also had a lot of damage. Evidently, there are one or two bridges there that have been washed away. Very much reminiscent of the cyclone, the Moina, a couple of years ago, I think in the 80s, that it happened. So we need to do a couple of things, and one of them is this. We need to have alternative routes into the port when such a thing happens. Secondly, we need to have holding areas around the country that we can safely stop the traffic and keep them there while we determine what's happening. And then finally, we need to have a plan to ensure that we have disaster management on the scene doing what they need to do and getting those temporary fixes in place.
It's really all about planning. It's all about planning for this kind of thing to happen again. Happened in 1987, happened 2 years ago. All the climate change people tell us that it is going to happen again. Are there other examples to follow? I mean, are there sort of plans in place to try and make some change? It's early days yet, obviously.
Look, as you say, it's early days. I'm not aware of any plans right now that have been put down in terms of long term. I think everyone's scrambling around to try and sort out what's happening now, but I'm pretty sure that they're going to have to be long-term plans. We're going to have to look at beefing up holding areas along the N3, definitely. This is a very, very busy road from Gauteng. And you and I have spoken about a tax on trucks before, where we've spoken about this very thing. So I think this is another reason why we need to look carefully at how we safeguard our logistics chains and what alternatives we have in place. So, for example, how quickly can we switch ships and containers to the ports around us, Richards Bay or down to East London? You know, that's also an important aspect of a plan to keep the wheels turning.
I don't want to sort of twist the knife at such a difficult time, but someone somewhere is going to be asking, is it quicker to repair railways after a big flood than it is to repair roads? I mean, it might well be the start of a much bigger policy conversation. Gavin, I do need to ask you another question about KZN very specifically, because we have had so much happen in KZN that has involved trucking. Now, I must just state at this stage that trucking's become a hot, almost political issue in several countries around the world at the moment. It is in the UK, it has been in France, it's becoming an issue here in various ways. It's not the fault of truckers or the trucking industry necessarily, by the way. But we've seen in KZN the sabotage on the N3, if I can call it sabotage, I think I can. We've seen the violence that happened in KwaZulu-Natal last year. All of this must be having a big long-term impact on your industry. Are you worried that this is going to mean that some trucking companies just don't survive anymore?
I'm very worried, Stephen. We've had a number of trucking companies that have disappeared over the last couple of years, and that's been around COVID as the main driver. But before COVID even arrived on our doorstep, we had these attacks on the trucking industry. Some of them were driven by the so-called the foreign driver, but there were also other syndicates that were operating in there trying to get certain operators out and trying to ensure that they got the work. It's become tougher and tougher for transporters to move the load, and in our case, we don't have an alternative. It's all good and well to talk about rail, but rail is just not an alternative right now. So we're very worried, because once the trucks stop moving, that means our economy does come to a halt.
Gavin Kelly, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate it. Chief CEO of the Road Freight Association.